I'm going to be talking to Graham Saul, who's the Executive Director of Nature Canada, about an open letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that was written by 200 leading nature organizations calling on the federal government to prioritize the protection and recovery of nature during this session of Parliament. So welcome to the interview, Graham.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, tell us about what's in this letter.
Yeah, so over 200 nature organizations from across the country wrote to Prime Minister Trudeau and other leaders calling on the federal government to move decisively forward with a few bold commitments that the government of Canada has made. We're at a bit of a turning point right now when it comes to nature conservation in Canada, and these are groups coming together to insist that the next couple of years rise to the challenge and the opportunities that are before us.
Now, the letter, I understand, calls on the government to bring nature to full recovery by 2050. Now, that phrase caught my attention. What does that mean by bring nature to full recovery?
So one of the exciting things that's happening in Canada right now is we're finally seeing the kinds of commitments that are commensurate with the scale of the biodiversity challenge. We know that we're witnessing widespread species collapse around the world, with as many as 1 million species gravitating towards extinction. And a country like Canada, what it does is globally significant. We've seen two really big commitments emerge most recently that are commensurate with the scale of the challenge. One is the commitment to expand protected areas in Canada to include 30% of our land, freshwater, and oceans. The other one is to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, ultimately with a view to full recovery by 2050. And what we mean is we need to begin to hold ourselves accountable for whether species continue to collapse and continue to gravitate towards extinction, or whether we are doing what's necessary to stop that trend and to reverse it so that nature can begin to restore itself towards a greater degree of full recovery. So the fact that the federal government, through both the Liberal election platform and more recently the statements from the Minister of the Environment, has once again reiterated its support for the notion of turning things around and has a bunch of big ideas on the table, is an exciting moment for Canada in terms of a vision for nature restoration as opposed to ongoing species collapse and extinction.
Now, one of the 5 key areas that the letter identifies is supporting Indigenous-led conservation and respecting Indigenous rights. And what kind of feedback are you getting from the government about the role of Indigenous peoples and communities in this process?
In some ways, this is really the most exciting thing happening in the conservation world in terms of us taking a new look at how we can most effectively move towards achieving many of those goals that I mentioned earlier in terms of radically expanding protected areas in the country and halting and reversing species collapse. There is no way to achieve those goals without the leadership of Indigenous communities. The boreal forest, for instance, over 600 Indigenous communities in the boreal forest. It's also absolutely essential as a country that we take reconciliation seriously and that we make meaningful progress on adopting the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, honoring the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and honoring the principles of free, prior, informed consent. So we have this opportunity for these two things to come together. Indigenous communities across the country are already showing leadership. When the government announced funding for support to expand protected areas, more than 100 Indigenous communities came forward and wanted to establish Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So the good news is that the government does acknowledge this, and that there's an opportunity to work at the intersection between reconciliation and nature conservation.
Another one of the key areas was getting nature-based climate solutions right. What does that mean?
Well, on the one hand, there's no question that nature plays a role in sequestering or releasing greenhouse gas emissions, right? On the other hand, we tend to measure this very badly. Our existing way of tracking, for instance, forest carbon has some serious flaws in it. This is clearly not a substitute for the need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to move as a society and as a planet as quickly as possible to phase out the use and stop burning oil, coal, and gas. At the same time, if we can invest in nature, if we can restore wetlands and peatlands and grasslands and protect forests, then we can also play a role that way in helping the planet respond to the challenge of climate change. There's also a number of very specific ways in which investing in nature plays an important role in helping species and human settlements adapt to the increasing kinds of severe weather events that we've been seeing around the world. But we need to get that right. We cannot allow investments in nature to be an excuse not to phase out fossil fuels.
And what about urban biodiversity? That's another one of your key areas. What are you suggesting there?
I think the COVID pandemic has really helped all of us understand the importance of nature in our lives. We have, in many ways, reconnected with nature in great new ways, and there's growing evidence of the physical and mental health benefits of immersion in nature. So human settlements are always going to be places where hopefully we are moving towards more energy efficient, more intensive communities. We want compact town centers that are bustling with pedestrians and cycling infrastructure and connected by world-class public transportation. But we also need to build in nature into those urban areas so that people can benefit from them and so that species are also able to find niches within them. So the government has made commitments to 15 new national urban parks. It would be great to see that roll out, like the Rouge in Toronto, across the country. We want to see investments in nature restoration. If the 2 billion tree initiative can roll out and put hundreds of millions of trees in urban areas with permanence, that can be a great act for nature restoration. And if we can begin to redesign our cities so that they are more friendly for things like birds and other kinds of species that we do share our city with, then cities can be a biodiversity positive rather than constantly negative.
Now, Graham, final question. Your open letter calls for the development of a comprehensive plan with timelines and targets. So I take it that the federal government doesn't yet have such a plan.
Well, that's the nub, right? So we have these commitments: 30 by 30, halt and reverse nature loss, growing work on nature-based climate solutions, 2 billion trees. But what we don't have is a clear vision from the government about how it exactly intends to achieve these goals in a way that maximizes biodiversity outcomes and works across programs as effectively as possible. We also, the good news is, though, we have investments in nature that are unprecedented in Canadian history. The 2021 federal budget made the largest investment in nature in Canadian history. So we have resources in the pipeline and we have big ideas. The will is there. Hundreds of organizations across the country are prepared to work with the government. The federal government says it wants to get it done, but we need to bring it all together into a strategy that's going to have impact. And right now, we haven't seen that from the federal government. So that's a big issue that the letter is directed towards addressing.
Graham, thank you very much. Really appreciate this.
Thank you very much.